Okay. Um, First one is why poetry? It's kind of a general question. The university is still offering courses in poetry, a sizable amount of poetry published every year to a diminished audience. So what's the value for the individual, for the society, both the writing of it and the reading of it? And how is poetry different in its contents or its form? It's pretty easy to tell what the difference in form is, but maybe more in the area of contents, form, and meaning from other forms of literature. So we got a motorcycle going by. All right.
Well, I think most people read and write poetry because they love it. I mean, it's true that some writers and readers of poetry dream of being famous for their reading or writing of poetry, but first and foremost, they're driven by love of the thing. If they just wanted glory, they could look into some other professions, is my thinking. So, I mean, I think that is the main thing driving it. People just love it, so they keep doing it. They keep reading it. They keep writing it. Poetry is different from other genres of literature, it seems to me, in the focus, in its focus on the physicality of language, its immediate delights. I mean, if you're interested primarily in story or idea, you're probably going to wind up reading or writing at some other genre of literature, mostly, I figure. I remember one time I was at a graduate reading when I was in grad school at Ole Miss. Grad students would read poems or stories. And during a break, this fiction writer friend of mine started talking about the difference between poetry and fiction. And he said, you know, one thing I don't understand about poets is they're always writing poems about writing poetry. You know, you don't see that in fiction. We don't write a lot of stories about writing stories. What is it with you? Why can't you get interested in something else in life other than what you do? But I understand what he's saying, and I mean, I'm somewhat sympathetic to his weariness with Ars Poetica poems. But I will say that poetry is always about the delight that one takes in language. And so it's only natural that you're going to have poems about language, about poetry. Because I think Wallace Stevens somewhere said something like, every poem has at least two subjects, you know, whatever it's purportedly about, and words themselves. And all poems are about words, in a sense, the delight in words. So I think that's something different about poetry.
Is your phone off? Just out of curiosity. Mine wasn't.
Mine is, the ringer's off.
Okay, that's good.
But I can turn it completely.
No, if you get a call, we can break that. That's cool.
I won't even know.
Yeah.
It won't ring or vibrate or anything.
Just a little further follow-up on that is,
Mm-hmm.
what do you see as the value of poetry for the society? I mean, it seems like in places other than the United States, South America, even like in Asia, Mao and Ho Chi Minh were poets in a sense. France, the death of a poet is a cause for national day of mourning.
Mm-hmm.
What is it about? What do you think poetry should do for the culture? What's its value as opposed to other forms of literature? And why do you think it's really not practiced as much in the United States as in many other countries?
Well, poets are crazy about words, and the experience of taking delight in words is a way of affirming the world, because so much of our experience happens in language. And so, in a way, I would say that the experience of the linguistically mediated experience of being alive and the pleasure of being alive is a central fact of poetry. And poetry does, I think, help you become more aware of the value of the linguistic experience you have talking to yourself, talking to other people. I mean, think of how much of our lives happen in language. and poetry should be the best language we've got. You know, the best words in the best order. But I'm loath to say it should do this or should do that. I do think that the second you say it should be doing this or should be doing that, someone will write a great poem that's doing neither of those things, and then you'll say, well, I guess I had been too rigid in my prescriptions about what poetry ought to be up to. Why isn't it more popular in the United States? Well, to read poetry well, you got to slow down. I mean, you've got to slow down and savor the words. And there's so much compression in poetry. Poetry is trying to do so much in so few words. I remember one time I was talking to Barry Hanna, who was a teacher of mine at Ole Miss, and he said, I like those poems that do what a novel does in just a few lines. I mean, it's a whole novel in there, you know. He was a novelist and a short story writer, so he admired the ability of a poet to get done in a few lines what he's trying to get done in a 200-page book. And it's kind of ironic in a way, because you would think it takes longer to read 200 pages than to read those 15 lines, but it's just not as difficult to read the 200 pages. Usually a novel, sentence for sentence, is easier going for the reader. And I mean, a good poem is challenging because it's doing so much in such a small space. And and I think Americans are these days living such fast-paced lives. They just don't want to sit down and really linger over something the way you have to do to really be a good reader of poetry. And so I think that might be part of it. But, you know, there are people out there reading poetry, and they're maybe not huge in number, but they're still there, and they're still there in the United States. And certainly there are so many people writing poetry now. I mean, anyone who works for a literary journal will tell you there is no shortage of writers of poetry. And, you know, there are people out there writing poetry who don't read poetry very much, and they're not very good writers. But a lot of people who write poetry read it really avidly. So you do have a lot of readers. It just happens that these days a lot of the readers of poetry are poets themselves.
Yeah, I think the point about the fast pace of American life has a lot to do with it. I've heard other people say that too.
Well, I have a lot of really well-educated friends who are readerly. I mean, they love to read. They read books all the time, literary books. They read literary fiction, creative nonfiction. But a lot of them don't read poetry. And part of it has to do with the challenges that you have to face as a reader of poetry. And also, I think maybe one of the projects of contemporary poetry has been to deny the reader the traditional sources of pleasure of poetry. So things that we normally expect to take pleasure in poems based on our experience of reading the canon, like story, conventional syntax, sonority, coherent metaphor, are being denied us by contemporary poets. And, you know, I don't know if it's that the reading public haven't quite caught on yet, or that the poets themselves are barking up the wrong tree. But there is a disconnect between poets and readers, and some of it has to do with just how deliberately difficult, and sometimes obscurantist contemporary poetry is.
True. It may be a little like modern art. Now the Impressionists, the abstract expressionists are pretty much accepted almost as standard stuff you can buy at Crate and Barrel.
Mm-hmm.
But the truly contemporary art, the stuff that's in the New York galleries now, the popular taste sort of shies away from it. So that may be true with poetry. I mean, it may take a while, a generation, to get that kind of to become the new canon.
It's true, or it may be that when readers of the future look back at this period, they choose as their favorites poets who weren't particularly well known in their time.
Hopkins or something in his time.
Well, you know, you wonder how future readers will make sense of this period in poetry. I mean, who will be more popular in 200 years? Lynn Hegenian, a language poet, or Richard Wilbur, a formalist, or someone in between may carry the day. I mean, I just don't know how it'll shake out.
In what ways as traditional Southern writers helped inform the American cultural experience? Is Southern writing as a category still a tradition capable of making important contributions to contemporary life? But have Southern writers sort of been absorbed into the great homogenous culture that we seem to all seems to be absorbing people? I'm going to get a real quick focus check. Yeah, there we go. So Southern writers.
I think a lot of Southern writers go wrong when they try to out-Southern the next guy. You know, who can be the grittiest, who can find the oddest backwoods story to foreground in his work, who can strike the most outrageous Southern writer pose. And some of those writers are more interested in their Southernness than in writing as well as they can. And that's a problem because the whole thing feels a little contrived sometimes, and that forced Southern. I kind of like what the 20th century poet Everett Maddox, who was associated with New Orleans, but really from Alabama, implies in his little poem Moon Fragment that some of this forced Moonlight and Magnolia's Southernness is just a bunch of moon pies being peddled out of stolen wheelbarrows. That's how it feels sometimes. On the other hand, a lot of my favorite writers were sometimes posers. I mean, Faulkner, Yeats. Sometimes writers do strike those poses, but the difference between the great writer who happens to have been a poser in some ways and the not so great writer who's a poser is that the great writer usually doesn't strike unconvincing poses in his work. You know, who cares what Faulkner does on the square of Oxford, Mississippi, you know, wearing some kind of bogus bomber jacket or something and pretending to have done things in the war that he didn't do. I mean, who cares? If his work is great, it's great. But if that inauthenticity or something that feels like inauthenticity, I mean, authenticity is a vexed concept, makes its way into the work, you got a problem. So, and I think a lot of Southern writers who are really interested in their Southernness live in fear that the South is just not as different from the rest of America as they wish it were, because they're trying to win cultural capital by associating themselves with a distinctive culture. And if that culture is not distinctive, guess what? The whole thing could be seen as a sham. And you know, the South is a lot like the rest of America in certain ways, but there is a distinctive Southern culture, especially in the rural areas. I'm living now in the Midwest. I mean, I can tell you there's a big difference between Midwestern culture and Midwestern cultures I've had truck with and Southern cultures I've known intimately. There are some differences there. And I like when some Southern idiosyncrasy gets into a poem in a way that feels genuine to me. The other day I was reading R.T. Smith's poem, Thrush Witch, and I couldn't help but be delighted to see this bit of folklore of the Thrush Witch that I grew up with being used well in a poem. That's a fun thing, but I don't think poetry should be conscripted into service on behalf of any agenda other than that of making good poems. And if the main thing someone is trying to do with his poetry is advertise his own Southernness, we've got a problem. So if the Southernness works its way in there and it's interesting and the particulars of Southern history show up, fine. If they add something to the work, if they're dealt with interestingly, that's great. But the first purpose should be to write as well as possible and not to advertise one's Southernness.
do you think that in the South, it's hard to say exactly what categorizes a Southern writer, whether they were born there, whether they went to school there, or whatever. But would you say that people you would consider Southern writers, yourself included, have a little more respect for the traditions of, traditional Southern poets and novelists and things like that than other parts of the country? Other than people born and raised in Ohio or something like that.
Hard to generalize, but I mean, Southerners are obsessed with genealogy, as we all. I mean, it's a cliche. I mean, it's sort of a truism of Southern studies that Southerners are obsessed with genealogy and obsessed with history sometimes. Not all Southerners. I mean, any generalization is tricky, but on balance, Southerners may be more preoccupied with history than some other communities in America. I don't know. I do think, I mean, somebody has said, maybe Leon Stokesbury somewhere wrote that Southern writers as a whole are probably more formalist leaning than American writers taken as a whole. American poets, if you're talking about poetry. A greater percentage of Southern poets might be formalist leaning than American poets. And maybe that has something to do with respect for the past, respect for traditions, poetic traditions. And, there are all kinds of tensions inherent in that, looking back on history and drawing from it. Some of my friends in the avant-garde would say that if a Southern poet writes with a classicist bent, he is making an investment aesthetically in images and stories that are essentially covers for subjugation of whole communities. I mean, that's a discussion we could have, but a poet, if no one else can, ought to be able to champion beauty even when beauty is concomitant with horror in the world as we know it. So the history question is interesting. I mean, it varies from writer to writer, but Southern writers are preoccupied with history. I think we can see that. I mean, that's a bright line. I mean, if you just read a bunch of Southern literature, you'll see that there's a feeling of the burden of history. But again, you get into all this like out-Southerning of each other. Which Southern writer can seem most grievously burdened by that history? I mean, sometimes it feels a little fake to me. And Southern writers who are invested in seeming burdened by history miss what's interesting right now in American culture, in the interest of building up this edifice of Southernness in their work.
Well, I think from reading your poetry, I think it'd be pretty easy to see your connection to the Southern environment. Are you really comfortable with sort of being pigeonholed as a Southern writer, like Greg Bonderville, Southern writer kind of thing? In what ways might readers find your poetry transcendent of regional boundaries? And how would you position yourself in relation to your poetic peers? I mean, in terms of content and style, and compare and contrast your work with your contemporaries, other contemporary poets.
Okay. Well, I mean, I grew up in Pumpkin Bend, Arkansas, which is a small farming community in the Delta, a swampy, cotton-covered region, and, sometimes this shows in my work. I mean, I'm a poet. I'm from the Deep South, so I guess it's fair to say I'm a Southern poet. But I'm not comfortable with that label, Southern poet, if it means that there's an expectation that I'll be performing Southernness like some kind of zoo animal for the rest of my career. That I'm not comfortable with. Because if you say Southern poet, you're saying, I have an idea of what Southernness is, and I'm expecting that from you. And I don't know what my next book is going to be like. I mean, I know what Gust, which is going to be published in the fall, is going to be like because I've already written it. But who knows where I'll go from here. So that's the problem with a label, is it becomes predictive, and then if you don't do what people expect based on that label, you have some disgruntled critics or somebody, and so that I'm not comfortable with. The other part of your question, or there were certainly, it had a few facets, but
Compare and contrast your contemporaries, like the work of yours that I've read, I regard as being primarily narrative. I mean, and this is one of the attractive qualities of your work, is that virtually every poem I've read of yours tells a story in some form or another. And I know there's been a tendency for a lot of modern poets to get away from traditional storytelling. That they go, well, you're more familiar with different varieties, but how is your poetry accepted among your contemporaries, and how do you differ with the way the contemporary poetry scene is going today?
well, let me kind of going back to the first part of the question real quick. Let me say this. I'm just not concerned about whether I'm called Southern or unsouthern. My priority is to write poems and write them as well as I can. So however that shakes out is fine with me, as long as the label doesn't become a kind of straitjacket, But I would say that my work is kind of like a slide in blues guitar, kind of trying to be on both sides of the lyric narrative divide. I mean, I'd say it's lyric, and it's sometimes narrative. There's quite a bit of storytelling in there, and that's true of a lot of Southern poetry, I would say. But I don't prioritize narrative over narrativity over lyricality. I really don't. And my first interest is not story. My first love when it comes to poetry is just the visceral, multisensory delight of words that I take in words. So I'd say that's the first thing for me. That's what makes me a poet. That's why I write it. I can't get away from it because I just love words so much. But I do tell stories. I mean, I grew up in a storytelling culture. I mean, how is my work different from some other? It's hard to contextualize me right now. My first collection of poetry comes out in the fall, and it's called Gust. But I'll venture a kind of preliminary characterization. Maybe what's different about my work from the work of some other poets is that the unity in it, at least if we're talking about Gust, which is what we have to talk about since it's the first collection, the unity is in disunity. In a lot of poetry books, you've got, in many a poetry book, I'll say, you've got a dominant voice or two and a dominant formal approach or two. And it makes sense that poets write their books this way, because that consistency of voice and of formal approach confers a certain unity on the book and frees the writer to explore a variety of subjects without letting the book get schizophrenic. But the question I'm interested in is, what if you just let it get schizophrenic? Wouldn't that be interesting in its own right for a number of reasons? What would it say about the self, or about consciousness, or what lies beneath consciousness? And so in my book, you don't have home base in voice or formal approach. You're denied that home base. And there's some crazy gear shifting with respect to form. I mean, you've got everything from a prose poem interrupted by Walmart intercom, some verse in a Zimbabwean meter called Zaimbwa, a poem that's a press conference in a Q&A form, Spenserian, a war poem in Spenserian stanzas. A lot of different formal approaches are being taken, and there's no central voice. I mean, there's everything in there from a floridly poetic sheriff to a Delta Italian who reinvents himself as an African American hot tamale street vendor. A little boy ghost who haunts his grandmother, blues men, Christian mystics, voodoo practitioners, a welter of voices. And so I hope that readers will find that crazy array interesting and get interested in what I'm trying to do with that.
The different voices sound really fascinating. I'm kind of interested in some of the background material that's gone into your consciousness as a writer poet. What would you say? Why don't you grab describe the early influences that have gone into your unique qualities. Specific points might be your earliest interest in the power of words. I remember you talking about words as more fascinating than toys, which I thought was really an interesting point. Your exposure to early exposure to race relations in the South, the twin influence of Pentecostalism versus voodoo, influence of family, community, early exposure to nature in a rural setting, and if you can handle all this, I'm just trying to feed a lot of stuff to you, but you have a prevailing interest in the preservation of the natural world, which comes out in your poetry and also in some of your political action, I would say. In what ways have your skills as a poet and journalist helped you to express and encourage the preservation of the natural world?
Okay.
Just take that,
All right.
and if you need a refresher or follow-up, I'll be happy to provide it.
Sure. And before I get to that, let me say something else. I remember there was a facet of your previous question that I didn't really address. You asked about how I might be transcending the regionality.
Yeah, I think, in some ways you demonstrated that just by talking about your book, the fact that you brought in all these different voices and influences, but if you want to address that,
Yeah, what I would say is that I don't think a poet needs to transcend region, because the way you get to the universal is by going as deep into the specific, the particular, as possible. And so, to use a well-worn but still true saying, all good writing is regional writing, because you're always going for the specific. If you're not homing in on home, getting to that particular, whatever it happens to be for you, what kind of poet are you? If all you're writing are empty, airy poems, you're just sort of peddling this colorless air, and that, bores everybody. So I think even the writers that you would never think of as regional are regional writers. Take the most extreme example, like my friends on the avant-garde side of things. They're regional writers in a way. Their region is the graduate English classroom in a sense. And I'm not saying that as a slight, just saying these poets are interested in embodying theory about, in poems, embodying theory about the insidiousness of received forms and the need to deny oneself the traditional sources of pleasure in poetry, like the ones we talked about before. And those ideas are really the furniture of the graduate English classroom, and writers write about the furniture they know. They wouldn't think of themselves as regional writers, but they are. They have a region. I have a region. And that's going to come up in the poem sometimes. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes you'll be surprised at what particulars a given poet dials in his poems. So that's what I say about that business of regional versus universal. The universal will be got at through the particular. And that's all a region is a constellation of particulars. So the early influences that's a question that relates to what we're talking about here. I feel blessed to have known some really interesting, colorful characters in my life. One person that you'll see written about a lot in Gus, the forthcoming book, is a Pentecostal pastor of mine named Brother Langston, who was just a remarkable, interesting man. with whom I disagreed on a variety of topics, but whom I respected for his devotion to the Spirit as he understood it. I was good friends with a folk artist / Pentecostal preacher named Sister Law, Ethel Leona Fitch Law, who was just a wonderful presence in the world. And I learned a lot from sitting at her house, which was like, well, walking into her home was like walking into her imagination. She had art all over the place that she had made. She had outbuildings full of art. Her husband was a builder, and she would take his scrap lumber and build these little buildings out in her backyard called things like the Playhouse or the Upper Room, which is a Pentecostal reference to the book of Acts, the Prayer Chapel, all these outbuildings too, full of art. And I was really drawn to her work and to just her way of thinking about things. She was a great talker, a great storyteller. I one time was eating barbecue at Shattuck's world famous barbecue in Marble, Arkansas. And is it Shadden's or Shattuck's, one or the other? I stopped in there because I had been there before and loved their barbecue. It's kind of close to where I grew up in the Arkansas Delta. And I sat down there, and this lady sat down beside me. I'd never seen her before. Her name was Puddin'. She introduced herself. We got to talking. And I asked her whether there were any blues men in her home community. Because I was about a county over from where I grew up, so I didn't know all these folks. And she said, "Honey, that's something that died back years ago. I'm sorry. You're getting here too late." And we got to talking, and after a while, she got more and more comfortable with me. She said, "You asked about the blues around here, and I didn't even think about my husband in them." And she tells me that there's this juke house scene that her husband was a big part of, where these folks would get together at this guy's house and barbecue and gamble and dance and play blues. They would set up on the musicians would set up on the porch. And so she said, "In fact, let me take your number. Maybe, we'll give you a call sometimes," because it had come up in conversation that I played music. And I was going on to Helena, Arkansas. Before I got to Helena, she called me. She said, "Hey, why don't you come back to Marble? I think they're going to play tonight." So I came back to Marble, and they ended up leading me on this circuitous route out into the country, and this vast expanse of cotton and this little shack in the middle. And it was owned by a fellow named J.R. Hamilton. And we had a juke house party, blues party, that was exactly like what Zora Neale Hurston describes in some of her work, and that I had collected folk tales about but never actually participated in. I thought it was something that had died out, and there it was happening right there in Marble, Arkansas. And I became a part of the JR's band and started playing with them for a while. But my point is, I just lucked into these things along the way. And of course, those relationships that I've formed have had a huge influence on my work. I guess I shouldn't say of course. I mean, some people might choose not to write about that stuff, but I do write about it. And there was I felt as a Pentecostal, country Pentecostal in Pumpkin Bend, Arkansas, a little bit isolated from the religious mainstream as it was. I mean, Pentecostalism itself is something of a kind of marginal religious culture. And we had certainly had a sense of ourselves as a peculiar people. In fact, a piece of scripture about the peculiar people was a favored one among the Pentecostals I grew up around. And then there was a lot of voodoo in my home county. I'm not talking about sticking pins in dolls. I mean voodoo rituals and people who had relationships with the voodoo loa, the spirits. And I came along just kind of after integration, which happened quite late in eastern Arkansas. But I had black friends from kindergarten on, and I ended up seeing that religious culture in action too. And in a lot of ways, Pentecostalism and voodoo are similar. But then, of course, in other ways, they're very dissimilar. And there are both synchronicities and dissonances there between Pentecostalism and voodoo. And, making sense of that as a young boy and adolescent and then young man was interesting and difficult. And so all of that feeds into the poems too, because I've always been kind of have a mystical bent. I mean, that was partly genetic, I guess, and then also it was fueled by these experiences with Pentecostalism, which is a mystical kind of Christianity, and voodoo, which is the central event of any worship service in voodoo is possession, or well, I shouldn't say of any voodoo service, but I would say that the possession experience is central to Pentecostalism and to voodoo, and so that mysticism fed into my kind of native mystical temperament, and so yeah, that comes into the poems too.
Your family is a really important influence. In fact, we might run out of tape on this. This only has 45 minutes worth of tape, so it's not like a full hour yet. But talk a little bit. I mean, I've known so many people who had dysfunctional family lives, and your regard for your parents is I think is unique. Can you talk a little bit about relationship to your father and your mother, and also to some extent, well, your brother too, but how music ties into that, the relationship between your father and you and music and your brother. I mean, I've heard you and your brother play, and there's a real communication there between the two of you on a nonverbal level that's quite moving.
Yeah, I mean, I was lucky to be born into a musical family. Every Brownderville male plays music, I think. I think that's true. I can't think of a single one in my whole extended family who doesn't. So, and it's not something that you were pressured to do. It's just we all did it. And, I grew up with those folk musics, old-time country, blues, southern gospel, hearing that stuff all the time, playing it. We all played by ear. Not a one of us can read music, as far as I know. And my dad was just a wonderful music teacher. I mean, he was teaching us that stuff. And my grandpa played a French harp, and Dad thought when I was little, actually my sister was in the 6th grade choir or something, and she had one of those recorders or flutophones that had been issued her by the school, and she brought it home and was, playing on that a little bit. And I picked that thing up. I was like 6 or something, and I started playing it, and Daddy thought I was doing a good job. I'm sure I wasn't, but he said, I believe you could blow a French harp. And so that Christmas in my stocking, I got my first French harp, and I started playing, and he couldn't really teach me because he didn't play. And my grandpa didn't really play or around me or want to teach me. I mean, he was a good guy. He just, I don't know, he had stopped playing music. But I picked it up and played in church and then played in blues bands. And my brother's a great blues musician, great gospel musician. We just had that going for us. I mean, that the music was there from the get-go. And Dad also has a very special feeling for language. And he has this kind of crazy attachment to unusual words. And it would drive some of us crazy, because if you were watching a basketball game or something and there was a player named something like, I don't know. I remember one time there was a player for Duke called Abdul Nabi. And Dad just loved that word. And he kept finding ways to say it all during the game, and it was driving Mama crazy. But he was always like that, and he loved the King James Bible. He's always quoting the King James Bible in interesting, kind of funny ways. And my mother has a very exacting kind of intelligence. She's a details person, and she is wonderfully supportive, though, of the music and the poetry and all. I mean, I never one time. I mean, this may be one reason that one of many reasons my relationships with my parents are so strong. Never once can I remember my folks naysaying my artistic leanings or pursuits. They never did. They never said, Greg, why don't you go get a real job or do something that's more practical. In fact, my dad, when I decided to play music after undergrad, went out and with his bare hands built a music room that we could jam in and practice songs in. And Mama was always in there making sweet tea for the band members when we were having practice. I mean, they just believed in me. And even though I'm so different from them in some ways, I mean, neither of them ever thought about being a poet. I mean, my family's not even readerly, really. I mean, they read the Bible and the newspaper and, books from time to time, but they'd rather be out, my folks would rather be out, working in the garden or, building something or, I mean, they have their interests and those are great interests and I appreciate what they do and they appreciate what I do. So it's pretty, it's a pretty good family and it was a loving, supportive environment for somebody who wanted to be a poet to grow up in.
I'm going to change tape at that point. When we get back, I want to go over some of your. You got a great description. Let's see if this is a good tape. You got a really good description of the idea of playing with words early,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd sort of like to see how that works out.
Yep.